at any stage you want to just tell me. So really what this is about, it's about meeting the requirements of projects. And most projects, well, all projects need an evaluation of some description to be done at the end. So what a lot of projects now are talking about is they talk about impact. So it's about the change that your project has created. So if you do a project in youth work, a European project, or a project in youth work at any level, if somebody is funding it, the likelihood is they're going to ask you what impact the project had. And so really, if you move on to the next slide there, it goes, what is impact evaluation? So impact evaluation really assesses how a program affects the well-being or the welfare of individuals, households or communities. So in the youth work contexts, it's really about how you have changed the lives of people in your community. And one of the real difficulties about youth work in particular, and doing impact evaluations in youth work, is it can be enormously difficult to say how your project has actually changed somebody's life. And the reason being is that, you know, people's lives are complicated. You might be working really hard with somebody and doing brilliant work with them, and who's to know that something could be happening at home that might make it difficult, or something might be happening with their mental health that might be making things difficult. So it might appear on the surface of it that you're making very little progress, whereas in reality you might be doing some great work. But that's on an individual level. But if you run an overall, a large project or a training program with a group of people, most evaluators, they want what's called a counterfactual. Okay, so what we mean by a counterfactual, so proper analysis of impact requires a counterfactual. And what a counterfactual is in evaluation terms, and this is quite technical, but and it's probably the only sort of complex piece of technique. What a counterfactual is that you need to compare a community or a group of people with whom you've worked with a group of people that you haven't worked with. So the idea being that if you do this course with a group of people and you don't do the course with another group of people, then the group of people that you do the course with should have different outcomes than the group of people that you didn't do the course with. So the group of people you didn't do the course with, or you didn't have the intervention with, are called a counterfactual. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, do, yeah.
Just, is it unbelievably difficult if you're trying to work with a group of young people to somehow create that counterfactual group? Because everybody is different, every community, every tiny little nuance factor, you know, neighbour could make a big difference. Is it impossible, or is it possible?
It's almost impossible. And the reason, but what makes it possible is if you have scale. So when it's possible is if you have something like a school community. So you 500 people in a school, and you 500 people in another school, and you do something really different in one school. And if the circumstances, if the school are reasonably consistent, so there are two schools in similar towns, and one has this project and the other doesn't, then it's reasonably okay. You probably will be able to use the other as counterfactual. But if you're working with 5 young people and you have another 5 young people, a row within one group can change the whole dynamic. So it can be really difficult. So the counterfactual only really works if you're dealing with very big groups.
Yeah.
So in youth work, oftentimes they can use this sometimes in urban areas where you might have a drugs project, or you might have a school retention project in one area and you don't have it in the other. And they can say, well, the outcomes for young people in the area where you had it were significantly different to the outcomes for the young people in the area that you didn't. And they can sort of draw conclusions from that. But in social science, it is really, really hard. In youth work, it's really, really hard to rely on the counterfactual because there's so many other factors that can come into play. And this is I'll just go on to the next one, is that one of the most difficult things in social science that's very different to chemistry or physics or other types of science. One of the most difficult things is to attribute what they call cause and effect. So this causal link between interventions and outcomes. So if, for example, in Youth Work Ireland tip here, we have a project working with young people who are in addiction, and it's a project that's looking at their health. And something happens that a number of those young people, there's very good outcomes for them. It can be really difficult to say that those outcomes came down to our intervention. You might be able to say it in some circumstances, but sometimes it can be really very difficult. And then what's even more difficult in evaluation in youth work in the social sciences is to say, well, for this group of people, these 5 people, this particular intervention worked really well. It's very difficult to say then, if we expand it and we include 100 people, that the outcomes for that 100 people will be equally good to what it was for the 10 people or the 5 people. Because, and we'll look at this here, because sometimes in terms of, even moving on through the slides, even in terms of looking at impact evaluation, what is useful is that it can make you think about what's working within a project. But usually the only reason that we do evaluations is to justify funding. You know, the reality is organisations oftentimes don't have the resources to do evaluations for their own sake. If the funders didn't require it, to be honest, we wouldn't be doing it. And I mean, that's unfortunate in one way. But if the funders are they're requiring a particular type of evaluation, then we need to do that, and we need to use that type of evaluation. And oftentimes what funders want to do the evaluation for is they want to pilot a project in Tipperary, and they want to measure it, and they want to check out how it's working, and then they want to be able to say, this is what worked in Tipperary, what we're going to do now is roll it out across the whole country. So they want to scale up. So they want an evaluation that can show them how the project has impacted and how scaling up will be cost effective, and that there will be cost benefits to scaling it up. So even now at the moment there's a value for money project being run in Tipperary, and part of the reason it's being evaluated as closely as it is because they want to scale it up. They want to make this the way it's done nationally. And part of what they're doing is going to be a counterfactual. So what they're going to be looking at is the impact that the project has had in the particular communities, and then look at other communities where there isn't a similar project and say, well, the outcomes in the community where the project is are quite different to the outcomes for the community where the project isn't. Now that's, I mean, it's how a lot of evaluations are done. I think a lot of youth workers and community workers would be quite challenged by that, you know, as to whether it's correct way of doing things or not. But we'll move on and we'll look at different types of evaluations in a little while. So this is, I suppose, impact evaluation. A lot of it is comparing what the circumstances where the project was there with circumstances where the project wasn't there. Okay, so if we move on, when we look at the logic model in more detail, we'll be looking at inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And inputs are the resources that go into a project. So when you're doing a project, say for example, travelers, support for traveller for children, or for support for disadvantaged children, or whatever it might be, the inputs into the project are the money and the people that you put into the project. So it's the things that go into the project. The outputs are the activities. So it might be a training program, it might be a trip, it might be a facility, it might be a building, it could be any number of things. The outcomes then are how many people went through the program. So the outcome might be that there was 40 traveller children participated and completed the program successfully. And then impacts are how the program changed the young people's lives and what changed as a result of it. So it is important to get your head around the difference between inputs, outputs, outcomes and impacts, because it's the language that a lot of people funders are using. So it is, and at the highest level is impact. What is the impact of the project? Okay, I'm not going to go through this. You can look at this again. It's much the same as what we were saying a second ago. So this is the monitoring and evaluation, the inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Okay, and it's, I suppose the logic is that one obviously leads to the other. And I suppose the point here being that the higher up you go, the more difficult it is to show cause and effect. So it is reasonably easy to say, well, we spent €500 and we ran a course. So it's easy to say that the inputs led to the outputs. That's fine. It's more difficult to say that we ran a course and 22 people completed the course. Now, and the reason it's hard to say that is that some people might have engaged with it sincerely and other people might have just been sitting there. It's very hard to, there's a judgment there as to the extent to which people engaged with the course. So the outcome, there might be two people who went through the course. The outcome for the two people could be very different. They both sat through the course, but they both might have had very different experiences and both might have engaged with the course very differently. So it can be quite difficult. It can be quite difficult to attribute the outcomes to the outputs. But what is much more difficult then is to come back in 6 months' time and say if you had 20 people who completed the course and 10 of those are now in full-time employment, it's very hard to say that the reason they're in full-time employment is because they participated in the course. Or maybe the participation in the course might be a factor, but it's very hard to say that it was half the reason or 30% the reason or even 20% the reason. So there was other circumstances, but the course was a significant factor. And the reason that that's sort of important is that funders really like to know these things. They like to know whether the 10 people who were in employment, would they have been in employment anyway if you hadn't run the course, or how much value was attributed to the course in terms of them having secured employment. So was it a very significant, and oftentimes the only way to figure it out is to ask the people themselves, to ask them how significant they felt the course was in them getting the job. You know, and that can be a sort of a difficult one to, because oftentimes it's very hard for them to be very clear as to what the exact reasons were. But it is important to ask people as well. And then the other sort of thing to be conscious of is the further you go up that line, the more external factors contribute to the cause and effect. So it might be that the economy improved or disimproved, and that might be the reason they got the job. Or it might be that they had done another course, and that might be, so there's external factors all the time that contribute to it. So I suppose the real point being that you need to be aware that this concept of counterfactual is there, but the really hard thing that you need to be conscious of within evaluation in the social sciences is attributing this cause and effect. And knowing that it's difficult is one thing. Funders will ask you to attribute significance. So you need to be conscious not to fall into a trap of oversimplifying by saying, well, the reason they got the job is because they did the course. Oftentimes you can say things like, the course was a significant factor, or you can interview them and they can tell you that the course was a significant, or in what way the course contributed towards them getting the job. But don't oversimplify, because if you do, you'll just end up setting traps for yourself. So you do need to be aware that this, when you're evaluating, that the attribution of cause and effect can be quite challenging. Okay, I'm just going to go through, we'll leave the logic model because we'll come back to it. The other thing, this one here, before and after comparisons. And this is another way of doing evaluations. So rather than have a counterfactual, what you do is you compare the circumstances in the lives of young people before they did the course and then after they did the course. And what you call this, the before is called the baseline. So you have a baseline survey before you do the project, and then you have another one after you do it. And again, to be perfectly honest with you, if the course that you're doing is of any great significance, you know, other things will have happened in people's lives while they're doing the course, and it's very hard for them to know whether the change was because of the course or because of something else. But it is better than the counterfactual, because at least you're focusing on the people that you're working with. You're not trying to compare them with another group of people. But again, in social sciences, it's easy to do this in maybe biology or in sort of more more straightforward disciplines or scientific disciplines. But in the social sciences, somebody can be in a bad mood on a particular day or in a good mood on a particular day, and all of a sudden their view of the project changes enormously and the evaluation can be different. Now we'll talk about evaluations in a second. I'll just show you some evaluation techniques. Okay, so the before and after is a sort of it's a comparison, and normally it's around monitoring, and oftentimes what happens as well is you have a baseline and then you check in with people over the course of a project, so it allows you to change things as well. I'm going to move on. Comparison groups. So this is what we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of the counterfactual. So you could see how you might work with young people and then have another group in a similar sort of club or whatever who aren't doing, who aren't participating in the project, and you could ask them questions about how things are going, but before, during, and after the intervention. So I suppose one of the real difficulties in relation to sort of ethically as youth work is that one of the real ethical dilemmas you face with is that if in this youth club here, or in Youth Work Ireland Tipperary, if we got resources to fund a particular intervention and it's not available to everybody, it's very hard for us to ask people that we're denying that support to participate as almost as guinea pigs to show us how well the people who are getting the support are doing, and how badly they're doing because they're not getting the support. So ethically, there's real issues in the social sciences with doing this. It's like in medical sciences, they call it the placebo effect. But ethically, if you're a doctor and you're testing medicine and you're giving some cancer patients chalk and other cancer patients medicine, and those that are getting the medicine are becoming well, and those that are getting the chalk are not becoming well. Like, it's great sort of evidence to show that the medicine is good, but ethically it must be enormously challenging to know that, I suppose, those that are suffering because of the research, or to give you the evidence, are not being given the medicine. So it's similar in the social sciences. The other thing that's difficult from a youth work perspective is that, ethically, especially when you're working with young people, researching the experience of young people, you have to be enormously careful about the fact that their participation should be voluntary. And that can be really difficult, and especially when you're talking about young people who are under 18. So a lot of this research around evaluating in work with young people can be very, very sensitive. But it is important because you do want to make sure that projects that are working well are given the credit that they should be. Okay, I'm going to you can look at this again yourselves. In terms of comparison groups, we were saying it is really challenging. And it can be really difficult. So if you look at there is this idea as well within impact evaluation, and it's called a black box idea, and you use it in science as well. The place in science that is most sort of used, or traditionally most used, is in things like weather. And weather uses this sort of black box theory, in that nobody really fully understands the mechanics of how weather happens. But what they've realized is that if certain things are done or certain conditions happen, then there's certain outcomes. So if pressures and if wind speed are in a particular way, there's a certain understanding of it, but there's a certain amount that's just based on an accumulation of observations. So you don't really understand what's happening, but you know that if you do this, this happens. And it's similar in terms of social sciences as well. Sometimes you don't need to understand all of the details. So if you're going into it in too much detail, it becomes confusing. So sometimes you just have to accept that young people in a particular project with particular resources, given particular support, that you have to trust that their lives will change in a positive way. And if you're trying to be too particular about saying what exactly it was about the intervention that made it particular, then you can end up spending more time evaluating a project than actually doing the work. So in some ways, one of the things that we need to start looking at, or that evaluators need to start looking at, is that good youth work or good community work, you mightn't always understand why it works as an outsider, but oftentimes youth workers know why it works, and it's very hard to put into pounds, shillings and pence. It's very hard to put into a sort of a spreadsheet. But what the evaluator needs to be able to say is that supporting a good youth worker to work in a particular situation with a particular group of young people will create positive outcomes. And that's like this black box. We don't exactly understand why it works, but we know that if we support people in doing a particular work in a particular way, then there will be positive outcomes. Okay, so the big thing about in methodological challenges, what we're talking about here is that it does cost a lot of money to do good impact evaluations. And the really bad thing is that most funders want us to do it but don't pay us to do it. So they'll want us to do evaluations but aren't prepared to give the resources to make that happen. So as community workers, as youth workers, it's important to challenge that, to say if you want the evaluation, somebody has to pay for it. The other important thing is baseline data, and it's something we don't often do, and it's something maybe we need to even look at in terms of things like Erasmus. When Erasmus project kicks off, we should nearly ask everybody to do a survey about their level of knowledge of the particular topic, and so we know going into the project what people's sort of circumstances, what their knowledge is, and then we can do a similar survey at the end. Because once the project starts, you can never do a baseline survey again. If you don't do it at the very beginning, it can't ever be done again. The next thing is the potential of secondary data. So what we mean by that is sometimes, if you don't have the resources, you don't need to do primary research. You can use other people's data to make your case in some circumstances. And I suppose the most obvious one with young people can be school data, school completion data, or school performance data, stuff like that, or data that maybe other services would publish. And then the last thing that you need to consider is that as a youth work organisation in particular, is how do you collect the data from young people? What approach do you take? And generally speaking, there are three ways of collecting data. There's a whole range of ways, but oftentimes we break it into quantitative data collection. And quantitative data collection is where you're doing things like surveys and you're collecting numbers, or you're doing head counts. And that's one way. And then qualitative data collection is where you're asking questions or you're encouraging people to tell stories. And then in the middle, there's what's called mixed methods. So it can be a combination of both. And I will look briefly. There's three. So quantitative, the typical one would be a survey. Or in the case of some European projects, you have to fill out key performance indicators. And effectively that's a survey. There's another qualitative approach that we can look at called most significant change, and that's about storytelling. And it's a completely different approach to the survey. It's really about getting young people to tell their stories. And then in the middle, there's another technique that's often used in youth work called the outcome star. The outcome star is a little bit of both. there's numbers involved in it, but there's also an opportunity for young people to talk, to tell their story, to express their concerns, and to move outside of the framework that's there. But there is a framework and there is numbers, so you end up coming out with statistics from an outcome star, but you also end up coming out with some useful input as well. So those are three sort of approaches to impact evaluation that you use at project level. You have the most significant change, you have the outcome star, and you have surveys. Okay, so that's really I'm going to, so these are the three here. What I've said here, IRIS is another, it's a survey. You've outcome star and you've most significant change. Okay, I'm going to stop it at that. Is that okay? And I'll